Hello there, today I'm here to do my March wrap up. I would apologise for having been gone for ages again, but honestly I think this is just how it's going to be. My main reasoning is that I haven't had anywhere to film. We're working really hard on the house to get everything up and together for when the baby comes. As you can see, we've at least got a semi-together bedroom at the moment. It's still a bit of a mess because of storage stuff and half our carpet's missing. But alas, I've managed to make a semi-decent filming area for today. So, I think what's going to happen with my channel, as I say, weekends are very much taken up at the moment with decorating, and also, obviously, in a few months' time there's going to be a baby. So, I think what I'm going to just do is be really easy on myself with my channel. This week, I will admit, I've had a bit of a wobble where I thought about just not making content anymore, and then that made me sad. And I still want to make something, but I think for the time being, all I can really make time for and find the brain power for, because we'll go into that more later, but my brain's just gone to mush. All I can really do in that sense is wrap-ups, and I think I'm fine with that at the moment. If my channel is solely wrap-ups, I'm sorry if that annoys people or people don't enjoy that, and I'm sure at some stage my content will bolster again, perhaps once the house is up and together, but for now that's all I can manage. And as you can hear, I'm quite breathless at the moment. I'm quite far along in my pregnancy now, so excuse me if I'm huffing and puffing. Right. That said, I also haven't been reading very much, and honestly I think that's to do with the brain mush thing. I can't really concentrate very well. I can't concentrate for very long periods. I'm very tired in the evenings. So for all those reasons and more, reading has just fallen by the wayside for like Netflix and stuff, which is fine again by me. I'm kind of taking it easy this year with reading, and I think I need to do that. But I have still read 3 books, which I'm going to talk to you about now. So the first of these was Little by Edward Carey. I've wanted to read this for a while because it's nothing like my book or the book that I'm writing, but there is that anatomy, that fascination with anatomy in a character which I wanted to get across. Basically, and I didn't actually realise this going into this is a fictionalised version of, I can't remember her name, Marie Grosholtz, who is the sort of founder of Madame Tussauds. Well, she is Madame Tussauds, I suppose, and it's a fictionalised account of her life and how she came to be so fascinated in these anatomical wax figures. And yeah, it just follows her through sort of, I guess, quite highlighted and dramatised events in history, which she may or may not have been present at. I really enjoyed this, and the first thing I will say is that often when I rate a book I will read through the reviews on Goodreads, and a lot of the reviews actually sort of tarnished this book and gave it really low ratings because they didn't think that it was an accurate representation of Madame Tussauds. It was entirely fabricated, etc, etc. Now I'm just going to go into this saying I don't know whether it's because I didn't know that this was like about Madame Tussauds. I just went into it knowing it was about a woman who was fascinated with anatomical wax figures. But the main thing to note here is that this is fictionalised. I don't know that it's even true to her life. I don't know that the author is claiming that she was at these events. I think he's just been fascinated by this woman and what could have kick-started her passion. I'm sure there is some research that's gone into it, and some of the events and the people in her lives are true. But it's a fictional, it's a fiction, it's a novel, okay? Can we just... I just think it's really unfair for people to say that it's, you know, it's too fabricated. It is a fiction. It's not a memoir or a biography. If you want that, this is not that. But it is really enjoyable in its own right. I have to say it's quite lengthy. It's quite wordy. It's kind of written in a kind of Dickens-esque style, certainly with the chapter titles in which such and such happens. And it's generally written in quite a Victorian-esque style, so it is quite wordy and it isn't the fastest read, but it's really enjoyable nonetheless. I specifically liked the start of this novel when there is kind of a more gothic-esque dark element, which is what I wanted out of this actually, because that's what I want to find in my own book. And I have to say that doesn't necessarily carry through, even though she is making wax models of dead people and things like that. The gothic element is kind of not in there as much as we go through it, but nonetheless, I really enjoyed it. It's really well written and just a generally fascinating book. Then I read The Wave Theory of Angels by Alison McLeod. Now, I read Unforgiven, I think it was called, or Unforgotten. I think it was Unforgiven, by Alison McLeod a few years ago. And I have to say it's the best book that I have ever just picked up on a whim and really, really enjoyed. It was just amazing. I would love to actually reread it. And so I've been wanting to read more Alison McLeod ever since then and have not done it. So when I saw this in a bookshop, I finally picked it up and I finally got to it. Now I will say I think this is I think it's probably a little bit over my head in terms of the philosophy stuff, and for that reason I think it was a bit choppy, it was all over the place, but nonetheless it's still beautifully written and I still enjoyed the body of it. So let me try and explain this. It's basically, as I say, the philosophical stuff entirely went over my head, especially at the moment. I'm just not in that headspace. But from what I got from this, it's basically about two girls, both called Christina, and one is living in the 13th century in France and the other is in, I suppose, modern day, and we spend most of the novel admittedly with the 21st century Christina. And one thing I would say is that I don't think the French 13th century part of the book needed to be there. I'm sure that is where most of the philosophical stuff came in, but I felt like I really enjoyed the 21st century story without the French stuff in there. But anyway, so both of these Christinas fall into an unexplainable deep sleep. And, you know, doctors don't understand it. They're assumed dead, certainly in the 13th century, and it's basically treated as a coma. And it looks at, I suppose, what happens to the Christinas in that time, what happens to her family when they're reacting to what's happening to her, and what happens when she wakes up. And I guess that's, yeah, there's a lot of philosophical stuff in here, certainly regarding the fathers' jobs, who are both kind of challenging the status quo either in the church or in science, and looking specifically at angels and the meaning of angels, what angels represent to us, I suppose. But also it just follows them trying to deal with what's happening to their daughters, and trying to overcome the guilt, I suppose, that they're feeling and understand what's been happening, and perhaps realising that they didn't know their daughters as much as they thought they did. It very much actually put me in mind in that thread of the story of The Tidal Zone by Sarah Moss, which I wasn't entirely blown away by that book, but I think if you liked that, you will probably like this. It's got the same father-daughter element to it, and the same worries about suddenly your daughter's health isn't as good as you thought it was, and what do you do about that, and how do you react to that, and how do you keep her safe. And yeah, there was that in there. As I say, it was a bit choppy for me. The plot didn't really come together in terms of the philosophical stuff. As I say, it might be that it just went over my head, but reading the reviews, a lot of people said the same thing. It felt like this book was trying to say something really big and it never really said it, but I still really enjoyed this and I was still really pushed to pick it up. So yeah, I would recommend, as I say, especially for fans of The Tidal Zone. But if you are going to start with Alison McLeod, I would say that her other book, Unforgiven, I think is a much better place to start. And then finally I finished with a book which, full disclaimer, I didn't finish it. I finished about 50 pages from the end because I just lost my cool with this book. So that's A Year of Marvellous Ways by Sarah Winman. Now, I've read God is a Rabbit, When God is a Rabbit by Sarah Winman. I read that when it came out years and years and years ago. And I thought that it was a novel with real potential. Admittedly, it's not a perfect novel. It's a novel that kind of tries to say everything and have every theme in there in one really short book. But it is good and there are really beautiful bits in there. And then I read Sarah Winman's Tin Man, which came out a few years after this one. And I really enjoyed that. So I thought I would just, you know, I thought I would automatically find this one quite a compelling read. I wouldn't say she's a favourite author, but I think she was quite a solid author. However, I really disliked this book. And I'm gonna say I don't know how much of that is the book's fault and how much of it is my fault. I wasn't concentrating when I was reading this. I was really not in the mood to be reading, so I was just picking it up for 20 minutes a day here and there and not really getting what it was saying. But ultimately, I feel like this is a book that tries to be really deep and meaningful and revelationary, and it just doesn't have the depth of character or the depth of meaning to achieve those goals. So effectively, we follow a soldier who's returning from the war. This is set in like just after the Second World War. So we follow a soldier who's returning from the war, Francis Drake, and we follow a woman called Marvelous Ways, who, I mean, I love the name Marvelous Ways, just gonna say that. She lives in Cornwall, and she kind of lives this really strange life. She's kind of a shaman kind of woman, I suppose. She lives out in the, like, near the sea in a boathouse, and she just does her own thing. She believes that her mother was a mermaid, and she basically gives people hope. She lets people realise things. She guides people spiritually, and then they go on and they forget about her. And basically Francis Drake ends up meeting Marvelous Ways in a way that I have to say isn't fully explained. It's quite strange how he ends up being with her, and yeah, it goes from there, and she tries to tell him these deep and meaningful things that are going to change his life and change his outlook and help him overcome his struggles from the war. But honestly, I feel like it just missed the mark a lot. So, and again, I say I wasn't fully paying attention because I couldn't fully concentrate, but then again, if it was a gripping book, I would have felt differently. Marvelous basically ends up just telling him all these stories about her life with no explanation as to what he's really doing there, what their relationship is, how this is formed, why is she telling him these things. It just kind of ends up her giving this massive monologue, which you can tell is meant to be really deep, and it just falls short. It just doesn't work because you don't feel connected to either character's story. You kind of just feel this disconnect, and you're thinking, what on earth is going on here? Yeah, it just didn't work for me at all. There's no characterization, there's no depth of plot. I think it really is a prime example of a rushed second novel, I'm afraid to say. And also, I'm not gonna lie, there is some beautiful writing in here. There are some beautiful metaphors, especially to do with nighttime and nature, but there's also massive overkill on the metaphors. So you'll get like a nice metaphor, or they're all nice metaphors, but you'll get like one really beautiful one, and then that will go into like a paragraph or 2 paragraphs of metaphor about the waves or the moon, and it's just like, why? So yeah, I really didn't like this one. I gave it 2 stars. As I say, I DNF'd it in the end because I just got to the point where I just wasn't enjoying reading it. What was the point? So yeah, sadly I didn't like that one. So that is all my reading for the month of March. Please let me know down below if you've read any of these, what you thought, and also what you've been reading this March, and I will see you next time. Bye.